Welcome to Forbidden Desires channel that we hope you will have fun with us. Enjoy watching. I was 24 when my world fell apart. The divorce from Jacob had been brutal, not in the way of screaming matches or shattered dishes, but in the slow, suffocating unraveling of everything I had built my life around. One moment I was a wife and mother, and the next I was a ghost in my own skin, drifting through days that felt endless. Meaningless depression consumed me whole, and I couldn't find the strength to climb out of the darkness. I wish I could say I fought harder. I wish I could say that I clawed my way through the grief, held on to my son Edward with every ounce of my being. But I didn't. I couldn't. And because of that, they took him from me. Edward was only 4 when he went to live with Grandma Olivia, Jacob's mother. I told myself it was temporary, that it was for the best. I was in no condition to care for him. I could barely care for myself, and yet the moment he was gone, I felt a new kind of emptiness, one that made the first seem almost merciful. I missed him with a force that I didn't know how to contain. It gnawed at me in the quiet moments, in the spaces between breaths. I would wake up reaching for him, only to remember that his bed was empty. I could still hear his laughter in the corners of our old apartment, but when I turned there was nothing but silence. It was Jacob's sister Rachel who kept me tethered to Edward in those days. She visited me often, telling me about him, bringing me drawings he made describing the way he asked about me. "He misses you, Evie," she would say, using the name I had almost forgotten belonged to me. "He asks when you're coming home." I didn't even know where that was anymore. A year passed before I was deemed well enough to take him back. I had fought to heal, clawed my way out of the pit, desperate to have him in my arms again. But when I went to claim my son, Grandma Olivia refused. "You weren't there for him," she said, her voice like iron, like judgment. "I was." I begged, I pleaded. I told her I was better, that I was ready. She didn't listen. She didn't care. It ended in court. That time in my life is a blur of sterile courtrooms and papers I couldn't understand, of being asked to prove myself over and over again. How do you prove you're fit to love your own child? How do you convince a judge that your worst moments should not define you forever? I lost. Edward stayed with her. That was the beginning of the real hell. The day the ruling came down, I sat on the courthouse steps for what felt like hours, staring at the cracks in the pavement, willing myself to disappear between them. Edward wasn't coming home. They had decided that my year of recovery, my therapy, my desperate attempt to piece myself back together wasn't enough, that Olivia was more stable, more capable, that my failure, my moment of breaking, was proof that I was unfit. I wanted to scream, to cry, to destroy something, but I had no strength left for any of it. Rachel found me there, sitting in the cold. She wrapped an arm around my shoulders, but I barely felt it. "I'll talk to Jacob," she murmured. "I'll try to convince him that this isn't right." I let out a hollow laugh. "Jacob doesn't care. He never cared." Rachel didn't argue because she knew I was right. Jacob had never fought for Edward, not in the way a father should. He had given his mother power over everything, let her call the shots. I was certain that if he could, he would erase me from Edward's life entirely, and for years he almost succeeded. I saw Edward, but only when they allowed it, supervised visits, limited hours. I was treated like a stranger in my own son's life. I missed birthdays, holidays, first days of school. I missed the way his voice changed, the way his legs stretched longer, his baby fat fading into the sharpness of boyhood. But worst of all, I missed him missing me. At first, when he was still small, he would reach for me, cry. When it was time to go, he would ask me in that soft little voice, "Mummy, why can't I stay with you?" And I had no answer for him. As he grew older, the questions stopped, the tears stopped. It was worse than the pain of him crying. Watching him accept that I wasn't coming back, watching the distance settle in his eyes, watching him stop looking for me. Grandma Olivia filled his head with lies. "She didn't want you, Edward, she couldn't take care of you, she left you," and he believed it. How could he not? I wasn't there to tell him otherwise. The few times I saw him, he was quiet, guarded, polite. In a way that hurt, he called me Mom, but there was no warmth in it. It was just a word, something obligatory, and I ached for him. I wanted to shake him, to tell him the truth, that I had never left him, that I had fought, that I had screamed in courtrooms and cried into pillows, that I had spent every night whispering his name like a prayer. But the words stayed trapped in my throat because I was afraid of pushing him away even further. Afraid of breaking the fragile thread that still connected us. So I waited. Years passed and I lived in the shadow of his childhood. I knew when his birthdays were, even when I wasn't invited. I knew which sports he played, even when I couldn't cheer for him from the stands. I knew that he hated living with Grandma Olivia, but that he never said it aloud. And then finally the waiting ended. Edward turned 18, and for the first time in his life he had the right to choose. The first time he showed up at my door. I thought I was dreaming. He was taller than I remembered, broader. His face was sharp where it had once been soft, and his eyes Jacob's eyes. My eyes held something unreadable for a long moment. We just stood there, staring at each other. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Then he spoke. Evie, the name struck me like lightning. It wasn't Mom. It wasn't cold or distant. It was familiar, like an old song I hadn't heard in years. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I wanted to see you. That was all it took. I pulled him into my arms, and for the first time in over a decade, my son didn't pull away. The first few visits were awkward. Edward was hesitant at first, polite in a way that made my C***** ache. He still called me. Evie still kept a careful distance, like he wasn't sure where we stood. I didn't push. I let him come at his own pace. Let him sit in my living room and sip coffee while we talked about small, meaningless things, his school, his job, the weather. But then something shifted. We had been sitting on my back porch one evening, the sky a deep shade of purple, when he said out of nowhere, "I've always wanted to ride horses." I blinked, caught off guard, really. He nodded, staring off toward the horizon, as if lost in some distant thought. Yeah, since I was a kid. I don't know why. I just always felt drawn to them. They're strong. Free, something warm bloomed in my C******. I love horses. I admitted softly. I used to ride all the time. Edward turned to look at me. His expression. Unreadable. You did. I smiled. I still do. One of my closest friends owns a horse school. I used to compete when I was younger. Before I had you, he exhaled sharply, shaking his head. I didn't know that there was something in his voice, something regretful, something that made my stomach twist. I wanted to tell him it wasn't his fault, that he had been fed lies for years, that I had wanted nothing more than to share these things with him. But I didn't. Instead, I placed a hand over his and squeezed. We have time now, I said. It's not too late. His eyes flickered with something, relief, maybe hope. And so a few days later I surprised him. When we pulled up to the writing school, Edward stared out the window, stunned. Are we? He turned to me, eyes wide. Are you serious? I laughed, stepping out of the car. Come on. He followed, hesitant but excited, his gaze sweeping over the vast open field, the wooden fences, the horses grazing in the distance. This place is incredible, he murmured. I led him toward the stables, where my friend Maria greeted us with a warm smile. So this is the son you won back. She teased. Has got your eyes. Edward smirked, and apparently her love for horses. Maria raised an eyebrow. Then let's see what you've got. Edward opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, I was already moving toward one of the horses, a tall, sleek black mare named Eclipse. I hadn't ridden in months, but my body remembered the second. I climbed onto the saddle. Something in me woke up. The wind rushed against my skin as I urged Eclipse forward, guiding her into a gallop. The world blurred around me, the pounding of hooves against the earth filling my ears. When I finally came to a stop, Edward was staring at me, completely speechless. Holy shit. He breathed. I grinned. Not bad for an old lady. Hey. He shook his head. That was insane. You looked like you belonged up there. Something in his expression made my breath catch. He wasn't just impressed. He was admiring me not as a mother, not as someone who had fought for him, but as a person. I had no idea, he said after a moment. All these years and I didn't know any of this about you. There was pain in his voice, quiet but unmistakable, and I understood he wasn't just realizing who I was. He was realizing how much of me he had been denied. I slid off the horse and walked toward him, placing a hand on his shoulder. That ends now, I told him. We'll start over. If you want to learn, I'll teach you. He nodded, his grip tightening around my hand. I want that, and so we did. We started taking lessons together week after week. At first, Edward was hesitant, but he learned quickly. He had a natural ease with the horses, an instinct that reminded me of myself when I was younger. This is the most freedom I've ever felt, he admitted. One afternoon, as we rode side by side along the open field, I smiled watching him. Now you understand why I love it so much. He glanced at me, something unreadable in his expression. I understand a lot of things now. The more time we spent together, the more the walls between us crumbled. Edward began opening up in ways he never had before. He told me about Olivia's rules, the way she controlled everything in his life, how he had begged to take writing lessons as a child, but she had refused. She said it was dangerous. He scoffed. She wouldn't even let me near a stable. She always said she was protecting me, but I think she just wanted to control everything. I exhaled slowly, anger simmering beneath my ribs. She told me so many lies. Evie, he said one night about you, about why you weren't there. He shook his head, eyes dark with frustration, and I believed them. I reached for his hand. You were just a kid. Edward, of course you believed her. He swallowed hard. I hate that I did. His voice was thick, his fingers tightening around mine. I miss so much, he whispered. So many years with you. I brushed a strand of hair from his forehead. We have now. He met my gaze, something fierce in his eyes, and I won't waste it. As the months passed, our bond deepened. Edward started coming over more often, staying late into the evening. We rode together, cooked together, sat on the porch, talking for hours. One night as we sat by the fireplace, after a long day at the stables, he turned to me and said something that made my breath catch. You're my idea. Evie, I frowned, caught off guard. What do you mean? His gaze was steady. You're strong, you fight for what you love. You never give up. Even when the world tries to take everything from you. My throat tightened, he sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. I don't just admire you as my mom. I admire you as a person, as someone I want to be like. Tears stung my eyes. I reached out, cupping his cheek. You already are, Edward. He leaned into my touch, his eyes soft. I just wish I'd known sooner. I smiled. Though my heart ached for all the lost time, we'll make up for it, and we did. We had lost so much, but we had found each other again, and that was enough. There were nights when Edward stayed over, stretched out on my couch, his long frame barely fitting at first. It was just an occasional thing. Too tired to drive home, too comfortable to leave. But as time passed, it became more frequent. It felt natural, like he belonged here, like he was making up for all the years we had lost. One evening after another long day at the stables, we sat on the porch, the warm breeze wrapping around us, the stars flickered above, and the soft chirping of crickets filled the silence between us. Edward rested his hands behind his head, staring up at the sky. I never imagined my life would be like this, he murmured. I glanced at him like, what? Free. His voice was quiet, thoughtful, and it sent a pang through my C********T. She controlled everything. He continued. What I ate, what I wore, what I liked, and I let her. I didn't know any better. I felt my nails dig into my palms, the anger I had carried for so many years. Anger at Jacob, at Olivia, at the court system that had stolen my son Matteo again, hot and bitter. I hate her, he admitted. I hate them both for what they did to you. I sighed. Hating them won't change the past. Edward turned to me, his expression dark. I know, but it doesn't stop me from feeling it. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. I spent my whole life thinking I had to follow her rules, that she knew what was best. But now I see the truth. She didn't want what was best for me. She wanted what was best for her. I reached over, placing a hand on his arm, and now he looked at me, then something raw in his eyes. Now I want to live my life the way I want to. A slow smile tugged at my lips. That's a good start. Edward chuckled softly, shaking his head. You make it sound so easy. I leaned back, watching the stars. It's not, but it's worth it. Silence settled between us again, comfortable this time. Then after a moment he spoke. I've never admired anyone like I admire you. I turned to him, surprised. You're everything I want to be. He continued. Strong, brave, you never let anyone break you. I swallowed hard, my throat tightening. I almost did, but you didn't, he said firmly. You kept fighting even when they took me away. Even when they made you feel like you weren't good enough. I looked away, blinking against the sudden burn of tears. Edward reached over, his fingers brushing against mine. I wish I had known the truth sooner. I wish I had seen you for who you really are. I met his gaze, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. Then I squeezed his hand. You see me now, I whispered. The next morning we headed back to the stables. Edward was getting better, more confident in the saddle, and I loved watching him ride. He was fearless, determined, the same way I had been at his age. Maria met us at the fence, arms crossed, a knowing smile on her lips. You've got yourself a natural here. Edward smirked. Think I could take Evie in a race? I scoffed, mounting Eclipse. You can try. And he did. We took off across the open field, the wind whipping past us, the world a blur of green and gold. Edward kept pace with me, his laughter ringing through the air, and for the first time in years I felt it, pure, unfiltered happiness. When we finally slowed, breathless and grinning, he turned to me, shaking his head in amazement. I get it now, he said. I raised an eyebrow. Get what? This, he gestured around us, the freedom, the adrenaline. No wonder you love it so much. I smiled. Took you long enough. We spent the rest of the day at the stables, writing until the sun began to dip below the horizon. Edward watched me carefully, studying the way I moved, the way I handled the horses, and something about the way he looked at me made my stomach flip. Admiration. It wasn't just about the writing. It was me. He admired me, and for the first time I let myself accept it. That night we sat by the fireplace again, our bodies sore from the day's ride. Edward stretched, wincing slightly. I think I pulled something. I smirked. You're getting old. He shot me a look, says the one who was complaining about her back this morning. I laughed, shaking my head. Edward fell silent, staring into the flames. I wish I had grown up with you. His words were soft, but they cut through me like a knife. I swallowed hard. Me too. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. It pisses me off. How much she lied to me, how much she took from me. I reached for his hand. She didn't take everything. He looked up, eyes searching mine. You found your way back to me. I whispered, that's what matters. His fingers tightened around mine. I won't let anyone take me away from you again. I felt my breath hitch, the conviction in his voice, the raw emotion in his eyes. It was almost too much. I squeezed his hand. You never have to leave, and he didn't. As the days passed, Edward spent more and more time at my house until eventually he stopped leaving it all. He moved in without ever saying the words, without making it official. It just happened. We fell into a routine, mornings at the stables, afternoons spent cooking together, evenings on the porch watching the stars. He learned everything about me, and I in turn learned everything about him. Our favorite foods were the same, our humor identical. We moved through life with the same rhythm, the same unspoken understanding. It should have felt strange, but it didn't. It felt like home. One evening, as we sat in the quiet, Edward turned to me, his expression serious. I love you, Evie. I smiled. I love you too. He shook his head. No. I mean, I admire you as a person, not just as my mother. I exhaled, my C******T, tightening. You're everything I want in my life. He continued. The kind of person I want to be, the kind of person I want beside me. His voice was thick with emotion, his gaze intense, unwavering. And for the first time I truly understood Edward had found me and he wasn't letting my story ends here. If you feel that this story is meaningful and brings useful lessons, please like and subscribe to the channel to support me. Thanks for listening and see you in the next videos.